Of all the names listed in chapter 5 of Genesis, there's one that breaks a pattern repeated 8 times in a row, and that break is the reason why, thousands of years later, people are still asking what really happened to Enoch. This isn't a late legend or the speculation of modern preachers. It's the Hebrew text itself that, after naming Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, and Jared, and closing each of those lives with the same dry phrase, "and he died," reaches the 7th name from Adam and simply doesn't repeat it. Instead, the text says Enoch walked with God and that he was not, for God took him. Many assume this is just a poetic way of saying he died peacefully, some kind of ancient euphemism, but the original Hebrew doesn't say that, and the most careful translators have noticed it for centuries. The word used, lakach, is the same one used elsewhere to describe a physical transfer, a direct taking, not a natural death described delicately. This is recorded in Genesis 5:24, a single verse that has sparked more theological questions than entire books elsewhere, and the detail is verifiable. It's right there, in the same chapter where every other man in that genealogy gets his exact age and his confirmed death. Hold on to that contrast, because by the end of this video you'll understand why the Bible chooses to stay silent precisely at the moment Enoch disappears. And that silence, far from being a gap, is actually the key to everything his life represents. To understand why this man matters so much, we first have to walk literally through the list of names where he appears, because the place Moses puts him in that genealogy is no accident. Genesis 5 isn't a boring list of names, even though it looks like one at first glance. It's a deliberate structure, a kind of heartbeat that keeps repeating, so-and-so lived this many years, fathered so-and-so, lived so many more years, had sons and daughters and died. That rhythm repeats with Adam, with Seth, with Enosh, with Kenan, with Mahalalel, with Jared, and later, after Enoch, it picks back up with Methuselah and with Lamech, all the way to Noah. The text is built almost like a drum beating the same measure over and over, year after year, death after death, reminding the reader that Adam and Eve's sin in Eden brought a real, measurable consequence. Mortality became the absolute norm of human existence. And then, right in the middle of that constant drumbeat, the rhythm breaks, not with a tragic ending, not with a premature death, but with an absence of death. Enoch is the 7th name counting from Adam, a number that in Hebrew literary structure often marks completeness or fulfillment, and many scholars have pointed to that position as likely more than coincidence within the passage's design. He's the father of Methuselah, the man who, according to the biblical record, would go on to live longer than any other human being recorded in Scripture, 969 years, and some have noted that the name Methuselah in Hebrew can be read as a phrase combining the idea of when he dies with "it will be sent" or "it will come," a reading debated among ancient Hebrew specialists, but one many find suggestive, given that, according to Genesis's own chronology, the year Methuselah died lines up with the year the flood began. Now, before we go further, I want you to pause for a second on something you've probably never had pointed out this directly. If this is the first time you're hearing that the Bible describes a man who didn't die, who was taken while still alive, with no explanation of method, no description of process, just the phrase "God took him," drop that in the comments, because that reaction, that mix of surprise and "I never thought about it this way," is exactly the one the biblical text itself seems designed to provoke. Scripture isn't interested in satisfying your curiosity about the how, it's interested in showing you the why, and that why is what we're going to dig up together over the next few minutes. Verse 21 of Genesis 5 says, Enoch was 65 years old when he fathered Methuselah. And here's where the first detail shows up that completely changes how we should read the rest of his story. The text says that after he fathered Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years. That means the moment Enoch becomes a father appears, according to the text itself, to mark the start of a relationship with God, described in a way used for no one else in that entire genealogy. Not Adam, not Seth, not Jared, not Lamech get this description. Only Enoch, and later, much later in the biblical story, Noah, of whom the exact same phrase will be used, that he walked with God. The expression "walked with God" in Old Testament Hebrew doesn't describe formal religiosity or a series of completed rituals. It describes a relationship of sustained closeness, constant companionship, like someone walking beside another person on a long journey, matching their pace, talking, staying present day after day. It's not an occasional visit to a temple or an isolated prayer. It's continuous companionship, described in almost domestic terms, as if God and Enoch had literally shared the same road for 300 straight years. 300 years walking with God is a number the modern mind can barely process, so it's worth putting it in perspective. Compare that stretch to the documented history of any modern nation, and 300 years is longer than the United States has existed as an independent country, longer than the time since the first permanent colony was founded in several regions of the Americas. It's an entire lifetime repeated 4 times over by today's standards of longevity. And through all of that time, the text doesn't record a single narrated fall, not one described conflict, not a single scene of moral failure attributed to Enoch, something that does show up, for instance, with Noah later, or with Abraham, or with David. That doesn't mean Enoch was perfect, because Scripture is clear that every human being except Christ carries a fallen nature. But it does mean the biblical record chose, deliberately, not to tell us about any failure of this man, and instead concentrated the entire narrative on one thing: the quality and the consistency of his relationship with God. Verse 22 adds that during those 300 years, Enoch had other sons and daughters, a detail that might seem minor, but is actually deeply significant, because it tells us Enoch's life wasn't that of a hermit cut off from the world, or a mystic who abandoned his family to devote himself exclusively to the spiritual. Enoch lived a completely ordinary life in its structure. He married, had children, built a household, probably worked the land or tended livestock like any other man of his generation in that region of the ancient Near East. His walk with God didn't happen in spite of his everyday life. It happened inside it, in the middle of shared meals, daily work, raising a large family, the normal noise of an ancient household. This contradicts an idea people often assume without realizing it: the idea that deep closeness with God requires isolating yourself from the world, stepping back from ordinary responsibilities, escaping the everyday to find the sacred. Enoch's story suggests the exact opposite, that the most sustained intimacy with God recorded anywhere in Genesis happened precisely while a man was raising children, running a household, and living inside the normal demands of his time. Verse 23 gives us the total. Altogether, Enoch lived 365 years. It's impossible not to notice the number, because 365 is exactly the number of days in a solar year, and several Hebrew scholars have pointed out this numerical coincidence within a genealogy where every other age is a far more irregular number, like Adam's 930 years or Lamech's 7 to 77. There's no firm consensus on whether this figure carries a deliberate symbolic meaning tied to the completeness of a full cycle, or whether it simply reflects the genealogical data as it was passed down, but the uniqueness of the number in such a specific context has caught the attention of Jewish and Christian commentators for centuries. What is undeniable, without needing to enter into numerical speculation, is that Enoch is by far the youngest man recorded in that entire pre-flood genealogy, living only a fraction of what his son Methuselah or his great-great-grandfather Adam lived. And yet he's the only one on that long list whose life is summed up not in years, but in a relationship. And then we reach verse 24, the heart of this whole account, the one that breaks the pattern we've been watching since the start of the chapter. Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more, because God took him away. Some versions translate that last phrase as, he was not found because God had transferred him, or he ceased to exist because God took him, and the different translations reflect something important. The Hebrew here is deliberately spare, almost abrupt, as if the text itself wants us to feel the suddenness of the absence. There's no mention of a tomb, no mention of a body, no funeral ceremony described, something that does show up, for example, centuries later with the deaths of Abraham or Jacob, whose burials are described with precise geographic detail. With Enoch, the text simply says that one day he was walking with God, and the next he was gone because God had taken him along. It's the absence of a corpse in a book that's otherwise meticulous about documenting genealogies, ages, and burial sites that makes this verse one of the most discussed in the entire Old Testament. It's worth pausing here to ask what this really means within the theological framework of Genesis. Remember that just one chapter earlier, in Genesis 3, God had told Adam that dust he was and to dust he would return, establishing physical death as the direct, inevitable consequence of the disobedience that entered the world in Eden. The entire 5th chapter, with its repeated drumbeat of "and he died," is literally the systematic fulfillment of that sentence, generation after generation, without exception, until Enoch. The missing phrase "and he died" in his case isn't a narrative oversight or a literary accident. It has been read by Jewish and Christian commentators across the centuries as a deliberate signal that something outside the universal norm of mortality happened to this particular man. An early hint built right into the text of Genesis that the sentence of death, though real and applicable to all of humanity, didn't have the final, absolute word over every human life. The New Testament doesn't leave this detail unexplained, and this is where Enoch's story connects to a passage very few people directly link back to Genesis 5. In the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 11, the writer builds what many call the Hall of Faith, a walk through the Old Testament figures whose lives exemplify trust in God, and the second name on that list, right after Abel, is Enoch. Hebrews 11:5 says that by faith Enoch was taken up so that he did not experience death. He could not be found, because God had taken him away, and before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. That verse confirms from the New Testament exactly what the spare language of Genesis 5 was suggesting. Enoch didn't die. He was transferred, taken directly from this life into God's presence, without going through the physical death every other human in that genealogy experienced. And it adds something more, a detail that connects perfectly with everything we've seen about those 300 years of walking alongside God. That before being taken, Enoch was commended as someone who had pleased God. It wasn't an arbitrary decision on God's part, with no connection to this man's life. It was, according to the text itself, the result and the culmination of an entire lifetime of sustained faithfulness. This is exactly the point in the story where I want you to consider something that probably changes how you understand this whole narrative. Enoch's faith isn't described in Scripture through a miracle he performed, or a battle he won, or a dramatic prophetic speech he delivered to crowds. The way we'll later see with Moses or Elijah, Enoch's faith is demonstrated, according to Hebrews itself, simply in the consistency of a relationship sustained over 300 years. That means that, for Scripture, the most praised act of faith in an entire genealogy of pre-flood patriarchs wasn't something spectacular in appearance, but the quiet faithfulness of a man who, day after day, year after year, kept walking alongside God in the middle of an ordinary life. But there's still another New Testament text that mentions Enoch, and this is probably the least known detail of his entire story, the one that answers the question we raised at the start and have left unresolved until now. In the short letter of Jude, the brother of Jesus, there's a direct quote attributed to Enoch, which is remarkable because there is no book called Enoch in the canon of either the Hebrew Old Testament or the Christian New Testament. Jude 1:14-15 says that Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these people, saying the Lord was coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones to judge everyone and convict all the ungodly of all the ungodly acts they had committed, and of all the harsh words ungodly sinners had spoken against him. This passage confirms something extraordinary, that Jewish tradition preserved a memory of Enoch, not just as a man who walked with God, but as a prophet, someone who spoke words of warning and judgment to his generation at a time, remember, right before the flood, when human wickedness, as Genesis 6 describes, had reached a point of widespread corruption. Here it's important to be careful about historical precision, because this quote in Jude doesn't come from any book included in the biblical canon. It matches, almost word for word, a passage found in an ancient Jewish writing known as the Book of Enoch, a text that circulated widely in Second Temple Judaism and was known and respected, though it was never accepted as part of the canonical scriptures by either rabbinic Jewish tradition or most Christian traditions, with the notable exception of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which does include it in its canon. Fragments of this book of Enoch written in Aramaic were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the caves at Qumran in the 20th century, which confirms this text was already circulating and being studied by Jewish communities centuries before Christ was born. The fact that Jude quotes this material doesn't mean the Bible is declaring the entire book of Enoch canonical. In the same way Paul in Acts 17:28 quotes pagan Greek poets without canonizing their complete works. It means there was something within that quote Jude considered true and worth including under divine inspiration in his own letter. What this passage does confirm, on solid biblical ground, is that the memory of Enoch as a prophet who warned of coming judgment was firmly rooted in Jewish tradition, and that the New Testament itself recognizes that prophetic role as a legitimate part of his legacy. There's one more detail outside the biblical text but historically verifiable, worth mentioning, because it shows Enoch wasn't a forgotten or marginal figure in the Jewish world of the first century. The Jewish historian Josephus, in his work Antiquities of the Jews, written in the 1st century AD, mentions Enoch within his account of the patriarchal genealogy and confirms the tradition that God took him, describing him as a man who returned to the divine. Josephus isn't an inspired source and carries no biblical authority, but he is a valuable historical witness because he shows us that, for an educated Jew of the 1st century, a close contemporary of the time of Jesus and the apostles, Enoch's disappearance was an accepted, transmitted fact, part of the common fabric of religious knowledge of his era, not some marginal curiosity invented much later. Now let's go back to the question we raised at the start, because we have all the pieces we need to answer it with the depth it deserves. Why does the Bible choose to stay silent precisely at the moment of Enoch's disappearance? The answer, if we pay attention to the full structure of Genesis 5, seems to lie in the deliberate contrast the chapter itself builds. Each of the other patriarchs gets a closed formula: born, lived, fathered, died. It's a complete cycle, sealed without cracks. The same cycle you and I will go through one day if the Lord delays his return. But with Enoch, that cycle is deliberately interrupted before reaching its natural close, and that interruption functions within the literary and theological design of the text, like a crack of light in the heaviest darkness of the chapter. In a passage entirely devoted to showing that death is the inevitable consequence of sin, Enoch's story appears as an early reminder, deliberately planted by the inspired author of Genesis, that a relationship with God has the power to transcend even that most final of all consequences. And here's something I want you to connect that you've probably never linked together before. Think about the name of Enoch's son, Methuselah, whose possible translation, according to many scholars of ancient Hebrew, points to the idea of when he dies, it will come, or his death will bring it. And think about the chronological coincidence, verifiable simply by adding up the ages recorded in Genesis 5 and 7, that the year of Methuselah's death lines up exactly with the year the flood began. If this reading of the name is correct, then Enoch, the man who walked with God and who was taken from this world before witnessing the total corruption of his generation, gave his son a name that functioned almost like a silent prophecy about the judgment to come. A father who walked so closely with God that his own fatherhood became, on this reading, an encoded message about the future. We can't state this as a closed, unanimous fact, since there's legitimate academic debate over the exact etymology of the name, but the chronological pattern is undeniable, and the connection, though interpretive, has been pointed out by serious Bible commentators for generations. Take a moment to consider what this means for how we usually picture the great men of faith in the Old Testament. When we think of spiritual giants of the Bible, we almost always think of Moses parting the sea, of Elijah calling fire down from heaven, of David taking down Goliath with a sling. We think in moments, in dramatic, visible instants. But Enoch, the man the Bible describes with the most extraordinary testimony of all, the only human being before the flood who entirely avoided the experience of death, did none of that. He didn't part any seas. He didn't defeat any armies. He didn't build any monuments. The only thing the sacred text records about him is that he walked day after day, year after year, alongside God, in the middle of a completely ordinary family life, and that sustained walk was enough for death itself, the most universal, inevitable sentence ever pronounced over humanity, to simply have no power over him. Before we move toward the close of this story, I want you to think about something. If you had to sum up your own relationship with God using the same expression Genesis uses for Enoch, walked with God, what word would you use instead? Would it be a relationship of occasional visits or a relationship of constant companionship? Write it in the comments, because that question, more than any historical or linguistic detail we've explored today, is probably the real reason Genesis decided to tell us this story in the first place. The generation Enoch lived in was not, based on everything the biblical text itself implies, starting in the next chapter, an easy generation to stay faithful to God in. Genesis 6 describes a world growing more corrupt by the day, where every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was continually bent toward evil, an environment pushing hard toward widespread wickedness and away from faithfulness to God. Enoch lived his 365 years precisely in that setting of growing moral decay, not in some paradise cut off from evil, but in the middle of the very world that, just a few generations later, would be judged by the flood. And yet, in the middle of that cultural current dragging humanity toward corruption, one man chose consistently, for 300 years, to walk in the opposite direction, not by withdrawing from the world as we saw, since he had sons and daughters and lived a full family life, but by actively resisting, from within that corrupted world, the current that was sweeping everyone else along. This is what makes Enoch's story more than just a curious detail from an ancient genealogy. It's a deeply relevant mirror for anyone today who feels their culture constantly pushing against faithfulness, integrity, sustained faith. Enoch demonstrates, with the full weight of the biblical text behind it, that it's possible to live in the middle of a corrupt generation without being absorbed by it, that faithfulness doesn't depend on external circumstances, but on the constant decision, day after day, to keep walking with God no matter what the rest of the world around us is doing. And it demonstrates something even deeper, that God sees, records, and honors that sustained faithfulness, even when no one else seems to notice it, even when there are no visible miracles or public recognition, even when the only proof of that life is, as Hebrews puts it, having been commended as one who pleased God. There's one more thing worth saying before we close this story, and it has to do with what Enoch's disappearance anticipates within the larger biblical narrative. Thousands of years after Enoch, another man in Scripture would be taken from this life without experiencing natural death. The prophet Elijah, swept up in a whirlwind before the eyes of his disciple Elisha, as told in 2 Kings chapter 2. And centuries after Elijah, the Apostle Paul himself would write to the Thessalonians about a future event in which believers still alive at Christ's coming would be caught up to meet the Lord, using in the original Greek a word, harpazo, that carries exactly the same idea of a sudden direct transfer we find in the Hebrew lakash used with Enoch. Enoch's story, then, isn't an isolated strange case within the Bible. It's the first link in a pattern Scripture repeats and develops across thousands of years, a pattern that declares from the very beginning of the biblical narrative that death, though real and universal as a consequence of sin, doesn't hold final authority over those who walk faithfully with God. And that brings us finally to the heart of why this story matters so much today, for you listening right now. Enoch wasn't a mythical character or a legendary figure invented to fill space in a genealogy. He was, according to the biblical record, a real man with a real wife, real sons and daughters, who worked, lived, grew old, and who, in the middle of all that, sustained for 300 consecutive years a closeness with God so constant and so genuine that Scripture found no better way to describe it than simply saying he walked with him. There was no dramatic conversion moment narrated, no spiritual crisis described, no single event that launched him into spiritual fame. There was, simply, the repeated decision, day after day, to stay close to God in the middle of a completely ordinary life. And that repeated decision ended up being so powerful that it altered even the final fate of his mortal body. If anything should stay with you from this story, it's not a date or a genealogical detail, or even the fascinating connection between Methuselah's name and the flood that came after. What should stay with you is the certainty that the faith that impresses God most, according to his own word, isn't always measured in visible miracles or spectacular moments, but in the quiet, sustained faithfulness of someone who decides again and again to keep walking in his direction, even when the whole world seems to be walking the other way. Enoch disappeared from the earth, but he didn't disappear from God's story. Instead, he became the first proof written on the oldest pages of Scripture that walking with God is the one road that never ends in a dead end. If this story opened your eyes to something in Genesis you'd never noticed before, subscribe so you don't miss the next biblical deep dives we're putting together. And if you know someone who needs to be reminded that quiet faithfulness counts in God's eyes too, share this video with them, because Enoch's story was written precisely for people who need that kind of hope.